Welcome to today's class, and today we're going to be talking about the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is how light enter into your camera, and this determines how your video or your pictures comes out. The exposure triangles is a team of three settings working together, which is your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. These three combines together determines how your pictures and videos will turn out. So let's get into it. The aperture is more like the eyes of your camera. The lesser it opens, the less light that comes in, and the wider it opens, the more light that comes in. And the aperture also controls how blurry or how sharp your background looks. So the lower aperture you use, the more blurry your background, and the higher aperture you use, the less blurry your background. So let's take some practical examples to show you how aperture really works. So the aperture is simply what controls how blurry your background will look like, or how sharp the background will look like. If you have a higher aperture, everything will be in focus. And if you have a lower aperture, the background will be very, very blurry. So right now, we're shooting in f2.0. That is, this is very, very low aperture. If we start increasing the aperture, you see that the things at the background will start getting clear. Can you see? The bottles at the back are now clear. Everything is now in focus. But if you reduce the aperture, they start getting blur. So aperture simply controls how blurry your background will look like. Either very, very blurry, or a little bit blurry, or very, very sharp. More aperture means less blurry background, and less aperture means more blurry background. That is why when you are getting a particular lens for your camera, when you check the body of the lens, you see some numbers on it. When they write probably f1.2, if you see just one number on it, like f1.2, that means it is a prime lens. So different lenses have different aperture, and the lesser the aperture, the more expensive that lens is. So that's why you see that when you buy a particular lens which is f1.2, it is more expensive than a lens that is f1.8 or a lens that is f2.4 or higher. So the lesser the aperture of your lens, the more expensive the lens is, because the lesser the aperture, the more blurrier the background will be. And that is what most people like nowadays. They want a blurry background for, for nice videos, for nice pictures. So this is simply what the aperture does. The aperture controls how blurry your background looks, and also the amount of light that comes into your camera. The shutter speed of your camera is how fast or slow your camera blinks. The faster the shutter speed, less light comes into your camera, and the slower the shutter speed, more light comes into your camera. So higher shutter speed freezes motion and is suitable for sports and action, while lower shutter speed creates motion blur and is suitable for night scene and artistic effects. So let's get into some practical examples to show you how the shutter speed really works. So this is simply how your shutter speed actually works. The shutter speed is actually how fast your camera is blinking. The faster it blinks, the faster it can see things and freeze motion. So let's say, for example, now we are shooting right now at 1/24 of the shutter speed. You can see that the fan is actually moving, but you cannot see the blade because the shutter speed is very, very low. That is, it is blinking slowly. If we start increasing the shutter speed, let's start taking it up. You start seeing difference in the fan movements. Can you see? This is now. You are seeing that now you can see the fan movements better. You can see the fans. You can see them rolling now because you have increased the shutter speed of the of your camera. So now it is seen faster. And don't forget, the more you increase the your shutter speed, the less light that comes into your camera. If you reduce your shutter speed, the more light that comes into your camera. So all the exposure triangles, the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture, they all control lights, but all of them have their specific work. For example, the shutter speed is all about how fast it is blinking. Your ISO is all about how bright. It is the brightness booster of the camera. And while the aperture simply deals with how blurry your background will look like. So that is simply how the shutter speed works. The ISO of your camera is simply the brightness booster of your camera. The higher the ISO, the more light that comes into your camera, and the lower the ISO, the less light that comes into your camera. So if you are shooting in a dark area with a very bad lighting condition and you increase your ISO, it brightens up the scene, but you may see grains and noise in your footage. But if you are shooting in a very bright environment and you are shooting in a very high ISO, this is going to cause overexposure. So you have to bring down your ISO to compensate with the kind of environment that you are shooting. So let's see some practical examples of how ISO actually works. So for your ISO, it simply controls how bright your footage will look. It controls the amount of lights coming into your camera. So if you increase your ISO, more light comes into your camera, and if you reduce your ISO, less light comes into your camera. So let's look at it. This is, we are shooting right now in ISO 64. So if I reduce the ISO, the video becomes a little bit dark. If I keep increasing the ISO, as you can see, it's getting bright, it's getting brighter. As you can see, yes, this is overexposure. So this controls the amount of light that comes to your camera. So if I reduce the ISO, less light comes into your camera, and if I increase the ISO, more light comes into your camera. So that is simply how ISO works. Shooting in auto mode simply means you are giving your camera the liberty to make decisions on its own. You have zero control of the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. Your camera determines the right ISO to use, the right aperture to use, and the right shutter speed to use. While shooting in manual mode simply means you are in full control. You are the one that determines the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. Shooting in auto mode is very good for beginners, especially if you have not mastered the exposure triangle. You can stick to the auto mode till you have mastered how the exposure triangle really works, and you can start shooting in manual mode. Let's get into a practical example of how the manual mode and the auto mode actually works. Auto mode means you are giving the camera the permission and the power to decide the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed of your camera by itself. You have no control over it. You can see I can't control the ISO. It's in auto mode. It chooses the right and best thing depending on the situation on ground. But if I switch to manual mode, this is in M now. M means manual mode. When you put in M, it is manual mode. Now I have control over everything. Let's say, for example, now I want to control the shutter speed. You can see the shutter speed. I can reduce the shutter speed. I can increase the shutter speed. I can increase my ISO. You can see I can increase my ISO because I'm in manual mode. I am in control of everything. I can also increase or decrease my aperture, as you can see. Manual mode means you are in full control, and auto mode, you put in auto mode, means you are giving the camera the full permission to do whatever it wants. It's the one in control of the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. So that's basically the difference between auto mode and manual mode. In videography, we have what we call the frame rate and we have what we call the resolution. The short form from frame rate is FPS, which means frames per second, where you see 24 FPS, 30 FPS, which simply means 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and 120 frames per second. Frames per second is the amount of images your camera captures every second. So if you are shooting in 24 frames per second, it simply means that your camera is capturing 24 images per second. And if you are shooting in 30 frames per second, 30 images per second, and same respectively, 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second. Under resolution, we have different resolution. We have the 720p, we have the 1080p, we have 2K, we have 4K. The higher your resolution, the higher the file size, and the lower the resolution, the lower your file size. And also, the higher your resolution, the higher the quality of your footage, and the lower your resolution, the lower the quality of your footage.